Just to give you a little background on me, my name is Francesca Lynn Arnoldy. I come to death work via birth work. I have been a birth worker for many years, so in the form of a postpartum doula and a childbirth educator and a labor and birth doula. And then due to a number of personal losses we experienced, it sort of opened my eyes to the realm of end-of-life care. And I found myself increasingly intrigued by the work as a doula, because what I found was just as I shift into a certain presence during birth, which is a very mysterious time, it's a very unique unfolding for each person, I find that I naturally do the same for end of life, whether it's helping people plan and prepare, or if it's during the actual dying process when people are actively dying, or during the grieving period, which could go on forever, but the acute grieving period. And so from there, I became a hospice volunteer, which I still do, and studied a lot, and then worked to, in my own mind, translate what it meant to me to support people emotionally at the beginning of life to end of life emotional support. So I created the end of life training programs for the University of Vermont. And I've written a couple of books. So I like to call myself a death lit author. I'm not a trained writer, but I think that it's so important to promote the idea of death literacy, which I'm sure no one here will disagree with. And so I've worked on topics such as training doulas and also providing support for children to prepare them for grief and support them through bereavement. And I've got a new book coming out in July that will be published by New Harbinger, which is called The Death Doula's Guide to Living Fully and Dying Prepared, in which I have pretty much just dumped my doula tool bag. So this morning we have a short period of time together. So I'm going to go through my tenets of doula care. And what you will notice is there will be some overlap, just as there is within any realm, especially with compassionate caregivers. So you'll see things that sound very familiar to the work that you all are doing in your different capacities, and also potentially some of the emotional support and informational support and spiritual support that teams like hospice or palliative care are providing. There is some overlap, and yet we are still trying to distinguish ourselves as a particular role. And within that role and scope, we do have some space for individually recognizing our own gifts and strengths and what we want to provide to the people that we're serving. So tenets of doula care. And I just told you a little bit about me. Currently, I am a researcher with the Vermont Conversation Lab. So we've worked on a story listening project, which is focused on bereavement. And we're now studying psychedelic assisted therapy. And so we're going through recorded sessions and looking for moments of human connection, and hope to be a place that will have clinical trials in years to come, fingers crossed. And I'm a hospice volunteer, and I call myself a community doula. So I still do support people through labor and birth and parenting, and also end of life, sometimes as a volunteer, sometimes as a paid person. So just to make sure it's known, doulas, the field, it's unregulated, it's unlicensed, and it's not covered by insurance, at least explicitly. There might be some ways that we can access funds through some insurance coverage, just like we can at beginning of life for pregnancy care and education and birth support, but that's where we're at right now in the field. So the main tasks of the doula are to provide emotional support and to personalize the experience based on each client's beliefs and wishes. And these tenets come from I have a short, concise guidebook called Cultivating the Doula Heart. So doulas accept that birth, death, and grief are normal, natural, expected parts of life. Now, just because they're universal doesn't mean that they're easy. We also recognize that these can be very complex and very difficult. They can be overwhelming, and anything in between. They could be also a relief. There could be people that we serve who feel actually quite comfortable with the idea of the life cycle and their own mortality, and people who are raging against it. So we meet people where they are and use their language and support them in their goals that they have. We provide non-medical, non-judgmental, emotional, spiritual support and soothing comfort measures. And we really recognize in our care that toward the end of life, if someone has a terminal diagnosis, and they're experiencing a disease progression, generally we see that people become increasingly dependent on others for their care, and they are increasingly rendered voiceless sometimes if it's not attended to. And they find that they have fewer and fewer opportunities for decision making. So as doulas, we really try to keep that in mind and try to make sure that we provide opportunities for people to make their choices throughout their time. So even when it comes to comfort measures, making sure that we're not making assumptions or jumping to conclusions. Maybe for some person, holding hands feels quite comforting, or a gentle foot rub, or brushing someone's hair, or thinking about my own grandmother painting her nails. She really loves that. For other people, touch might not be invited, and it might not be comforting, and it could be actually a presence with some physical distance and maybe reading a special book aloud, and that could be comfort to them. So making sure we're providing an array of options when it comes to comforting someone during difficult times. Doulas create inner calm and peacefulness. This is very important because we don't ever want to escalate a situation that might be overwhelming. And so as a doula, I'm constantly trying to assess and sort of read the room and ascertain what different people's levels of comfort might be. How involved do they want to be at this moment? And that can shift and sway. Sometimes you are with a family, and maybe if your person has a built-in natural network, they have some caregivers, they have neighbors, loved ones who are visiting. Sometimes some people are more comfortable really being a primary support role, and other people really aren't, and they feel quite nervous. Now, as a doula, we might be able to provide information, and that might ease some of the nerves. But all throughout this, we are focusing on, in our own inner selves, being calm and peaceful. And then from there, we know even on a neurological level that when we create calm within and around ourselves, that other people are invited to then feel that calm and then calm themselves down. It just naturally sort of happens as interdependent beings. We promote informed consent. So we really advocate for people to have all the information they need to make their best decisions. And we don't know what we don't know. So it's really important that when there are questions, or when there are, because we have an awareness of an unexplored potential pathway, that we really have those conversations with our client and ask, do you want to talk about other options here for you, potential options? So I always talk about BRAIN as a great acronym to remember at any decision-making point. So going through the benefits, the potential benefits, and then the potential risks, and then any potential alternatives. And for each of those, you would, again, have to assess the benefits and risks. And then intuition, how does it feel in your gut? How is it landing for you? And then the N would be, can we say not now? Can we say no? And what might happen in that case? And that way people are able to have these important conversations with care providers, especially, but also in the sense of exploring end of life options, where they're going to be, who's going to be surrounding them, and potentially disposition options, people looking into, I support people with researching just recently green burial options. What do I have available to me, and what are the contact numbers? So bridging people to these different options is really an important part of our role. Related to that, gathering relevant information and connecting them to beneficial resources. So in the doula program, part of the homework is, according to the topics of each module, we ask our learners to go do the research in their own community, find out what is actually available so that they have an awareness of it. So when a client is struggling with a certain choice, they might be able to say, hey, I've worked with somebody who has decided to do this, or I know of this organization that might be beneficial. So if it's not within the role and scope of the doula themselves, they can still bridge people to what they need. We assist each client with having personally meaningful experiences, together developing wishes for care and encouraging the preservation of energy for what's most important. And we don't know going in. mean, you and I might have an idea in our own minds about our own end of life and what our priorities, what we imagine our priorities might be for that time. It could look quite different for someone else. So we ask, we build rapport, we have those conversations, and then we attempt to support them in how they're going to spend their time. And wishes for care, I mean, sometimes these are some legal forms. I've had additional training for advanced care planning, especially in our particular state. And so sometimes I do assist people with completing their advanced care directives, but it could also be supplemental forms. Like I have developed my own form called Contemplative Wishes for End of Life Care. And it's really taking people through the atmosphere, the who, what, why, when, where, and not so much when, actually, we skip over that. And getting into who you are as a person and how can we honor you as a person during that time. We trust in the inherent wisdom of each person to discover their own best path. So as an undergrad 20 years ago at UVM in a psychology class, I learned about the concept of unconditional positive regard. And that has really stuck with me. So it's trusting that people inherently have the inner capacity to find their way and navigate their own way through a situation. Even when they're doubting it themselves, doulas will attempt to cultivate trust that the person actually has within them what they need, the strength they need, and the wisdom that they need. And so our job becomes creating the conditions around them, which include that steady belief in their ability to do this work of being human and being mortal, and also providing that information and access to beneficial resources as well. So those are the conditions that will support people in digging in and finding their own voice and their own truth. We companion rather than treat, and we serve rather than help. So just some language differences there that tend to come up, and we find that ability to be equals, the ability to be a human who's holding the hands of another human through this walk, and to not pretend that we have all the answers, to not pretend that we are experts on the end of life or death. And sometimes we will wander through the journey alongside someone and also wonder alongside them in awe when there are so many unanswerable questions. But in the very least, we know that people aren't alone in their journey. They have a presence, a compassionate presence alongside them. We empower and encourage a client's loved ones to operate within their comfort zones, and we complement care as needed. So thinking back on when my grandfather was dying, I often use this as an example because I naturally shifted into my doula presence, which means that I'm kind of moving in or moving out in accordance to other people's needs. And once I entered into his final few days, my grandmother felt a lot of relief, and she was able to then take care of herself for the first time in quite some time. And they were both in their 80s. My grandmother, she just turned 91 this week. But, she's in her 80s, and it's a lot of work caring for a loved one at home. They were receiving hospice care, but that's not round-the-clock care. So the major effort was really on her. So when we traveled to be with them, she was able to then sleep, and she hadn't really been able to sleep much, and then move into her place of comfort, which is hostessing and cooking things for people and preparing coffee for people and tending to them. And she would sort of come in and out of my grandfather's space, and that felt much more natural to her. And that created a sense of safety for her because I was able to move in closer. So she knew he was well attended to, and she could also be herself during this experience. And for my uncles and my mom, it was the same. They were able to be themselves and find their place of comfort. And it's always fully invitational for people to move around within that space. But I try to create a lot of permission for people to be who they are and be where they need to be during that time, which often feels very foreign because we're not really brought up witnessing the end of life as we had historically. So doulas promote self-care as vital to preserving and sustaining energy levels and enhancing wellness. And a lot of doulas will step in for respite. So that does allow caregivers, exhausted caregivers to be able to care for themselves, maybe attend appointments, maybe take a nap, maybe go grocery shopping, or simply go out to coffee and read a book, and how important that is to be able to give someone a break as they are doing the hardest thing. So during each visit, our time is determined by what is most pressing for the client, and it also depends on each doula's specific range of offerings. So as I've been talking about, these are more of the ways of being, and then I'll try to quickly go through some of the ways of doing. So we offer practical support and a lot of emotional support. So we support clients through the purposeful work of meaning making, story sharing, life reflections, and legacy projects. And so you'll notice that doulas might feel called to certain aspects of the work. I tend to feel really called to this part of the work. I love listening to people's stories. I love hearing about who they have been and who they are in the world, who has been important to them, their struggles, what they're proud of. And then through that, which often it starts as informal conversations, we could sometimes decide to capture them, and they can become legacy projects or remembrance gifts that we can leave behind for other people. It's really a beautiful part of the work that I know, at least for me, I feel like is one of my most favorite parts of being a doula, because not only does that encourage reflection, which can lead to healing in people, but then it also leads to creating gifts that can support mourners in their time of acute grief. Vigil planning and vigil setting. So for me as a birth worker, this reminds me a lot of when I create birth wishes with people, and I can create vigil wishes for people who in advance could really imagine what might be most comforting to me during that time. And this is the time of active dying, when often people are no longer communicative. So we can think about the setting, and we can think about the sounds. We can think about if they want music to be played. Are there any certain scents that really appeal to them? It could be chicken soup in the kitchen simmering. It could be cookies baking. It could be a certain aromatherapy or fresh flowers. It could be their father's cologne. There are so many different parts of this that we could explore, and so that we can really personalize it. And often with these wishes, if we're thoughtful about it, we can move them from one placement to another, because sometimes we have in our minds an ideal location for our end of life, and sometimes that has to change based on our care needs. And so how can we recreate that scene elsewhere if needed? And then doulas can provide a continued presence as a story listener during the initial grief and bereavement phase. Again, I lean on my work as a birth worker, and what I noticed time after time was when I would attend a birth with people and then I would go visit them postpartum, they would often feel this need to share their story. And I was with them every moment of this birth, and still they had to tell their story. And it's a very natural process of coming to terms with something major and profound that happened to you, is to create your narrative. And so sometimes we have to share our stories over and over and over again before they really start to make any sense to us, before we can integrate what happened and figure out who we are because of that and who we are following that. The same thing goes for a major loss. So when we check back in with loved ones, if that is desired, often we can invite them to share their process, their experience. What was that like for you? And then basically sit back, create a place of silence and non-judgment and acceptance, and allow them to sort of look back and piece together the puzzle. And this is part of the research that we've been doing at the Vermont Conversation Lab, and hopefully we will continue to do story listening projects in different capacities, even beyond grief. So a doula will never operate outside of a contract. So private practice doulas, by and large, will have a written contract so that it's very clear the expectations, the chosen offerings, and the client and family, if there's family involved, will sign it, and the doula will sign it as well. So doulas will never perform tasks for which they are unqualified, or about which they are uncomfortable, and that has to do with the contract again is really important, and then having discussions along the way. We will never disrespect a client's privacy or disrespect clients based on any of these factors, or act as a medical care provider. And so doulas need to be really thoughtful about this, because we often have people come through and become doulas in their training, whether formally or informally, and they're using the term doula. You have to really separate out. If you hold another license, potentially, you have another role, that you're very clear when you're explaining to people, you know, what are you operating as during this visit, during this work that we're establishing a contract for. And then here are some components of the doula heart that we went through most of these. Beginner's mind is something I didn't talk about specifically, but that's really having curiosity and making sure that we're not acting as that expert. We're constantly learning from death itself, from grief itself, and from each client that we serve. Oh, and you can find me, just lastly, you can find me at contemplativedoula.com, or you can search my name, Francesca Lynn Arnoldy, and keep in touch with me that way.
So hi, everybody. My name's Dina Stander. I live in Western Massachusetts, and I use the term end-of-life navigator to describe my work. And I do that because I came into end-of-life work first as a funeral celebrant. And in my work with people really at burial, sort of after death, I found myself listening to their stories. As Francesca mentioned, people really have good stories to tell and important stories to tell. And I realized I didn't know enough about death and dying. So I became curious, and I became a hospice volunteer and did other things, including a hospital chaplaincy internship that caused me to create a burial shroud company. So I make burial shrouds for green burial or natural burial or traditional burial or conventional burial or cremation. They work every which way. And the experience with shrouding made me more and more curious to work with people who are dying. And I found myself in a doula training. So I call my work being an end-of-life navigator, and the doula piece is very much a part of that. And I wanted to come in after Francesca's wonderful explanation of sort of all the facets of being a doula and tell you just a couple of stories, two stories that sort of illustrate the scope of what this work is when you sit down with a person. The first person I'm going to call Raul. He would love it if I refer to him as Raul in my storytelling, but to preserve his privacy, called me because he had read an article in the paper, in the local newspaper. Somebody had interviewed me about my work in end of life, and he called to see if I would meet with him at his home to talk about a couple things, his ideas about how he might want death to happen for him, and he wanted to set up advanced directives, and he wanted to do some planning because all of his family was out of state. He wanted to do some planning and have some paperwork in place so that at the time of his death it was easy for them to find those things, and know that he wanted a reception in the church basement with egg salad sandwiches and ham salad sandwiches, and would we all please sing When the Saints Go Marching In. And I held this information for him. And we had a really interesting long story together. So Raul, this is a number of about 6 months after those first conversations in his home. And over that period of time, we made a to-do list. He saw his primary care physician and set up a MOLST form. He decided to give away his car because he didn't feel safe driving anymore. And I helped him think through that decision-making process. And then there were holidays and I hadn't heard from him. And finally, I left a couple messages, and a friend of his called and said, he's in the hospital. He had a really bad fall. And Raul had a really fast decline. And this picture was taken in the skilled nursing facility where he went after the hospital, and it was clear he was never going to be going home. And we had talked, and I followed him. So in the beginning, in our consultations, he was paying me an hourly rate. But when he was hospitalized and moved to the skilled nursing facility, I followed him because he was my client and my person, but nobody was paying me anymore. And that was okay. It was a transition in the care relationship. And I think it is part of doula care that we have this kind of flexibility. And what happened was, I was the person who really had the story of how he wanted his death to go. And he was on a very different trajectory suddenly in the nursing home. And over a couple weeks, I was in touch with his son by text, and I got the son to send me photographs to my home that I took to the nursing home, so I could sit with Raul and we could look at photos of his family. And I was able to bring some things from his home so that he could see them around him in his space in the nursing home. And I was a regular visitor, and he became more and more agitated there. And I had told his out-of-state son that I was concerned. And then I came one day and Raul looked at me and he said, "Are you the person I need to talk to about getting sprung from this place?" And I realized that there was another option of a place where he could die. And it was clear to me visually and talking to him that he was likely hospice eligible. So I contacted his son, who contacted the hospice, who came and evaluated and said, yes, he is hospice eligible. And in the residential hospice, there's a bed available for him. And I took this picture the day before Raul was transferred to the residential hospice. And he had been very worried. I gave him the pillow to hug, which is a real doula thing to do. Here, what is at hand that I can give you that will be comforting? And the nearest thing was this pillow, and he held it and felt comforted. And when I went to see him the next time, was 2 days later, and he was in his bed in the residential hospice, and there was classical music playing for him, and he had a grape jelly sandwich and a cup of tea. And he looked at me and he said, "Thank you. This will go better now." And in this moment with him, I learned so much about what a doula can do across the trajectory of a person's end of life journey. He was driving when we met. You know, the other part of this story is that Raul died about 3 weeks before COVID landed on us. And so there wasn't any possibility of the lovely memorial service he planned. But last summer, I got an email from his son saying, "I'm coming with my kids and my brother. We're gonna scatter Dad's ashes. Would you join us?" And we did. We got together, and all of us, and I got them to sing "When the Saints Go Marching In." So that last piece of his wish carried through, and the spirit of the whole thing. And I do think that this is what doulas can offer, is some continuity over a journey, and a well-timed pillow, communication with the family that supported this human being's end of life journey so that it was more gentle and more humane. And Raul didn't get everything he asked for or wanted, but he got enough of the pieces, and he had been heard and supported. So that's one story. The other story I want to share with you is more recent. And I was contacted by a family member of an elder who didn't have children, had been a single person all their life. And there was a nephew and the nephew's mother, actually a sister-in-law of the dying person. And they wanted to know, because she was asking them to help her die. and she was in a decline where, yeah, it's end of life, and sometimes it's very sudden and we can't predict, and there's all these things, and you guys are the FCA, so and you're not afraid to look at this stuff. But sometimes I think people get a little trapped in sort of the vicious circle of emergency room visits and then back to their assisted living thing. And they could use more help, but they don't really need more help. But do they need more help? And sort of figuring all this out. And in the meantime, they're saying, I feel that my life is completed. And this is what this elder was saying to her family. I have had a completed life. I want to be done. And can you help me? And where there is not medical aid in dying, that becomes more complex. So they called me and we sat down to think about it together and to talk about what this elder's needs were, what her actual medical situation was, and what the parts, again, the parts to sort of lining up the ducks for having an outcome that might serve her needs and reduce her suffering. So this is my core tenet as an end-of-life navigator: resolve obstacles and reduce suffering. So here was a person who was saying their life is complete, they feel ready, they have cascading medical issues. So again, there was a medical appointment. She was taken to see her primary care physician. They reviewed her MOLST form. They went through sort of what her issues were. The doctor felt that a hospice evaluation was an appropriate thing. I went before the hospice evaluation to talk to the elder, who had a very difficult time communicating because of strokes, and was cognitively quite sharp, but could only communicate by forcing out short sentences in a shout. So that's how she told me she felt her life was completed. She shouted it. She shouted it. And I was very clear that it was appropriate to sort of get these things in motion. And the hospice evaluation happened. And she chose a time when she would start hospice, and her family assisted her in a journey of voluntarily stopping eating and drinking. And they had hospice support. And I was called again as a doula, after we sort of got all this in motion. They didn't need me very much for a bunch of this. And then after her last breath, I was called again, and I grabbed some things from my garden so that I could go say goodbye to her. And I had talked through with the family which funeral home they might call. We talked about whether they wanted to spend some time after last breath with her, saying goodbye. We did that. We played some music. We sat very quietly in the completeness of her life, and we honored her. And it was a new experience for her family members. There were just the two of them there to be there with her, and we didn't rush, and her death wasn't an emergency, and all of the necessary things got done. And as a doula, what I know that I did for this person was I resolved obstacles and reduced her suffering. And that is the arrangement that I make with people. So I hope that those two stories are, oh, I have one other story. So this comes from really from my being a funeral celebrant, but combined with all of the learning from being a doula. I met a family a couple weeks ago to do a a memorial service in the woods and burying ashes with them. And it was very sweet. And but there was a 6-year-old in this very small family group who had lived with her mother and her grandmother had died. And I said, what can a doula do for a 6-year-old at their beloved grandmother's memorial service? And I brought a little box, and I had a label that I put on it that says Grief Navigator Toolkit, and it has a little illustration of a bunny sort of inside a teapot drinking tea. It's very, very sweet. And I gave it to her, and it had some milkweed fluff in it. I said, you can let these go. You don't have to keep them. But I said, but this box is for you to put things in to remember this day. You can collect things from the woods here, or you can write letters to your bubby when you need to send her letters, or you can just put feelings in here. This is your Grief Navigator Toolkit. And that was the combination of a celebrant's wisdom and a doula's nurturing. And I watched this 6-year-old explore with her box and put things in and take things out and put things in and take things out. And I felt such joy at being able to bring something that simple as an empty box to a funeral, and have it be a nurturing thing. So that is my my presentation on being an end of life navigator and doula.
Thank you so much, both of you, Francesca and Dina. These have been wonderfully moving visions of how you do your work, and I think it's very stimulating for people to watch it now and who will watch it in the future, to give them some ideas to think about, that this is not something that is a set of rules that has to be followed in a certain way. What I get from both of you is how innovative it can be and how you think on your feet as things evolve. It's not a process that is prescribed. And I admire the fact that both of you are so good at being able to improvise. That's the word I was looking for. I'm looking at the chat feature. What connection are you making between FCA and doulas?
People interested in how end of life care happens. I think that there's crossover in our communities. The FCA is caring about resources, accessibility to those resources, affordability of those resources, and transparency, I think, in the funeral industry, and works hard for that. And I think that it's important for doulas to know that the FCA exists, first off, because there's so much sharing we can do. I send at the bottom of my website, by the way, which is dinastander.com. At the footer of my website, there's an FCA link. And I send people to the FCA all the time for resources in their own community, and for support around funeral options in their own community. So that, that's what I think the real relationship is, that we are people who care about this time of life.
I just want to say thank you for just very inspirational sharing of information. I'm in the process of considering becoming a doula for end of life care, and so I do have a question. And Francesca, I was able to read your book. I literally just completed it last night. So very, very good book. It really just opened my heart into what it's really like to have the doula heart. But I do have a question. How would I balance the act of like planning? I'm used to being an organized person, planning when I am about to have a meeting with a client or go visit them or have a care session with a client, and also just allowing them to guide, taking care of their needs at the time. I'm just a little bit say I'm really trying to figure that out. Like, how do you come in with a plan, but then also when you get there, just allow their needs to be priority?
That's a wonderful question. You know, sometimes our plans go straight out the window, and we have to sort of feel okay about that. And we have to come to some level of acceptance that we're not failing our person we're caring for, and they're not failing us. That's something that I often think about, is making sure that my client doesn't feel like they are disappointing me. So I'll give you one example. I was working with somebody, and this was through hospice volunteering, but I bring my doula heart into that as well. And his partner had really hoped that he would engage in something creative while he was experiencing end of life, and he was very resistant to it. And I don't force people to do anything. It's very invitational, it's always available, but it's not forced upon anyone. And so surprisingly, he had agreed to work with me on creating a piece of artwork, and his partner was thrilled about this. And I knew within my own self, I had to be careful not to get too excited or attached to the idea of actually completing this. So as we were finishing that visit where he said, okay, yes, I'll do this one thing with you, I had to sort of say to myself, like, don't get your hopes up. It may happen, it may not happen. It's totally his call. I'm on his timeline. It's not about me. And it's not about his partner either, even though that's hard. I balance the needs of everybody involved, but I really do focus on my client. And so I said, I'll bring all of the supplies for our next visit. And if you still feel like it's the right time for you and you're interested, we will complete this art project together. And I remember as I was entering into his home for that visit, I checked myself at the door and I was like, it may happen, it may not happen. If it doesn't happen, make sure you don't make him feel like he is disappointing you or anyone. He needs to make his own best choice. We ended up completing the project and it was beautiful, but I knew that there was a possibility that there could be another pressing need, or he might not be in the mood, and I would just have to roll with it. And so you really do have to kind of set your agenda aside, and that can be difficult to navigate. Now, I also want to point out that you mentioned that you're very organized and you're a planner. That can really be beneficial as a doula. And some people feel called to being the scheduler. And as Dina was saying, we have this vantage point, it's very broad, and we can see all the bits and pieces that are involved. And so for some families, that's a really valuable asset for a doula to bring, is you can create the calendar for people and look at, when are the medical appointments and the visits from different team members, maybe if it's hospice or palliative care or a family medicine doctor. And then when are you most energetic? When do you have your energy that you would want to gift to visitors? And so you think about that and creating a schedule. And how long would you want to visit? And which people do you want to invite in at certain times and not? So there's so much that you can do to kind of highlight your own strengths in this work. So I'm so happy to hear that you're joining our community.
Thank you. Thanks for that answer.
Listening to our two presenters, this came up in a kind of just tangential way with Dina's presentation. Dina or Francesca, talk a little bit about fees and how a doula is paid, or if a doula is paid. You mentioned you reached a point where the person you were assisting was no longer able to pay you, but you stuck with it. Could either or both of you speak to the question of money, which I imagine can get a little bit awkward in some instances?
One learns how to communicate very, very clearly about money. I offer all of my services on a sliding fee scale. So there's an hourly rate that starts here and slides to there, and you pay what you can in that range. And that works for me. I don't think that kind of arrangement works for everyone, but it works best for me. And that I do that because I don't believe that end-of-life care should be expensive. I believe it should be accessible. And some people can pay me $135 an hour without blinking. And for a lot of people, $35 an hour is a stretch. And that's pretty much the range that I'm working on right now. I also offer services pro bono without fee. And that's another thing that I'm very clear about. So I got a call once from a friend who had stopped by to visit friends in town, and she was leaving town, lived in another state, knew I do doula work, called me up and said, hey, these people can't pay you a dime, but can you check in on them because I think they need care. So I called them and I said, your friend called and said you might need care. There wouldn't be any fee. And so I came into their situation right at the front saying, this is not a fee relationship. They get the same care from me that anyone in my care does. We talk about what their needs are and how I can sort of fill in and support. And so, I think it really depends. There are concierge death midwives who really charge a premium. There are people who come into doula training because they seem to be the person in their family who's always asked to help when someone's dying, and they want to be more skillful as family caregivers, and they become trained in order to bring that skill to their family and share it more. So you have people who will never take a dime for, who will say silver will never cross my palm for this work. And you have people who charge, $300 per visit, and it's really a range. And if you are engaging a doula, you should have a clear conversation with them about money upfront. How'd I do, Francesca?
Beautiful. I also have a sliding scale fee. I did as a birth doula as well. And sometimes that's, think about like a la carte. Sometimes people just want something specific. They want to work on a remembrance gift project, or they want to work on their advanced care planning forms, or sometimes it's a longer relationship. So you might have a package, or you might have a per hour, and that can vary. I also sometimes do pro bono, and for me, I always get something in return. So especially if it's a topic maybe I haven't dug into and a person's struggling financially, I can easily tell them this will be very beneficial for me to research as a doula in my future offerings to people. So that's totally fine. It feels very mutually valuable. And I just wanted to make sure we mentioned that at the moment of death, that legally doulas do not charge money following a person's death. So we might be there, and it depends on the doula. I mean, in my own life juggle with all the work I'm doing, I don't make myself available for vigil sitting and for companioning people through that last part of life. I don't have the availability to be on call right now, but some doulas do that. Now, if you're with someone as they're dying, while they're dying, they have died, you might still remain a presence there, and you can provide support, but you're not charging for those services unless you are a licensed funeral director and you've shifted into that role, and there's an understanding about that. Doulas do not charge. Families are in charge of that. Some doulas are trained in different capacities and roles, but we have to be very clear about that.
I'm glad that Francesca made that distinction, because it is very important. So with this family that I showed you the hands with the flowers, that was not a paid part of my time. That was just honoring the person who had died.
Thank you both for answering that question. I think that's very important for the client to understand, and for people who are considering engaging a death doula. I think some people may hesitate because they assume it's too expensive for them. So I'm glad you tackled that question. Money is always an awkward thing, and one of the things FCA Maine is dedicated to is trying to get beyond the awkward issues of how much all of this is going to cost, not only the funeral and the disposition of the body, but how do we approach all of this, and are we going to go broke doing it? So thank you very much. Blessings on all of you doulas. You're doing wonderful work. Thanks very much for tuning in, and we'll see you next year for another annual meeting. Thanks, everybody.
Safe travels.